In teaching nonprofit law and governance for many years now, I've noticed that some students who are not intimately familiar with nonprofits think that they are very similar to for-profits and then get confused on the who's who in nonprofit organizations. So I thought I'm going to start off by providing a brief overview of the who's who in these organizations. Structurally, nonprofits are different from privately held companies, which are run by their owners. So private held companies are anything from your local favorite food truck to your body shop to your dentist office all the way up to the Trump organization. But they are similar to business corporations, public corporations, where the ownership is dispersed and the board supervises the management on behalf of the ownership. But similar to privately held companies and different from business corporations, nonprofits tend to be very small to medium-sized. There are a few exceptions. Here we can think of the big nonprofit universities or hospitals, which can have budgets in the several $billion range. Otherwise, nonprofits and for-profits are fundamentally alike in all unimportant respects, to quote Alison Graham's famous dictum about nonprofit and public management from a few years ago. It's important to point out that nonprofits can, and indeed need to, generate an excess of revenues over expenditures, which you may call profit if you have to, but those surpluses, as I would prefer it, cannot be distributed to any owners or members, officers, directors, etc., but must stay inside the organization and be used for mission purposes. The second big difference is that nonprofits engage volunteers for programmatic work as well as in their governance. So except for very, very small grassroots organizations which have no staff and where the board is doing all the work, nonprofits generally have a board of directors, they have an executive and a staff. So who is who in nonprofits and who is called what? Let's start with the board. The board of directors is sometimes also called the board of trustees. Directors, trustees, same difference. You can safely ignore that distinction, there is none. They are generally unpaid volunteers, which makes them different from the corporate board, where people get paid for the board service. This is extremely uncommon in the nonprofit sector, and there are only very few exceptions, typically small family foundations. So directors, trustees are volunteers. Now they may get reimbursed for expenses that they occur in the course of the board service, or for specific services that they provide to the organization, such as consulting jobs. But again, they do not get paid for being board members. Boards have various officers, such as a president, a treasurer, a secretary, vice presidents of different sorts, depending on what the organization likes. But again, these are all volunteer positions drawn from the board. The presiding officer is sometimes called president, sometimes board chair. Again, there's no difference between the two. The third thing that we need to know is that boards are either elected by the membership, if the organization happens to have a voting membership. Otherwise, the board will select its own members, if vacancies arise. This is called a self-perpetuating board, and this is typical for the vast majority of nonprofits in the United States. And again, it's a big difference to the corporate boards, where the ownership, the shareholders, determine who's serving on the board whose purpose it is to oversee the management on behalf of the shareholders. In non-profits, there are no owners. They're owned by the public, so nobody can appoint new board members. So the boards have to do it themselves, again, if there's no membership. And then there's the executive. The executive is the person hired by the board to run the non-profit and oversee the rest of the staff. Again, this position is called different things. It can be called the executive director, which is traditional and typical for the small to medium-sized organizations. But these days, the larger organizations also like to call the executive either president or CEO. Now, whatever it's called, it's a paid staff and not a board position. Even if it's called the executive director. It's still different from the directors on the board. And maybe you can think of it as the directors on the board directing the whole organization, whereas the executive director directs the staff and the daily work. Complicating is this that executives serve typically as ex-officio members of the board though. Ex-officio members, they attend board meetings, they provide their expertise to the volunteer directors so they can make informed decisions, but they do not get to vote on their own. If the executive is called president, then the presiding officer of the board is called chair. You cannot have two presidential positions in one organization, right? If the executive is called chief executive officer, the executive as well as other members of an executive suite, like the CFO or the COO, if there are such, they are still paid staff and not board members. So these officer positions are different from the officers of the board. And do not get them confused. So whatever the executive position is referred to, it is always subordinate of the board, but in charge of the rest of the staff. Okay, so much for my opening spiel here. Let's have fun this semester. Thanks.